My nights as a nurse in the ICU began like rituals, a litany of practices set to the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors and the soft sighs of ventilators. Each corridor of St. John's Hospital was awash with muted colors, the walls a pale blue that seemed to absorb the faint light, casting long shadows that flickered with my every step. I was a creature of the night. My uniform, crisp and white, glowed softly under the harsh fluorescence that never seemed to sleep. My routine was as predictable as the tick of a clock. Starting with room checks, I would adjust IV lines, softly speak to those awake enough to hear, and meticulously note down any changes in the patient charts. My patients, each fighting their own silent battles, had faces etched with lines of pain and exhaustion, their skin often pale and clammy to the touch. It was a tableau of human vulnerability, framed by the sterile clinical environment of the ICU. I had grown accustomed to the stillness, a sort of eerie calm that only hospital rooms know, where whispers were swallowed by the sigh of air through vents and the soft rustle of sheets. It was during these hours that I felt most alive, my senses heightened, every small sound or shift seeming amplified. However, familiarity breeds a sort of numbness. Each night blurred into the next, with little to differentiate one from another, until they became a tapestry of routines and faces. The repetition was comforting in its own way, providing a framework within which I operated with a practiced ease. It was during one of these methodical rounds that I first heard about Room 19, which had remained vacant for weeks, now suddenly occupied. My colleagues whispered about the new patient in hushed tones usually reserved for discussing the critically ill or the dying. I paid little mind at first, focusing instead on the immediate needs of my charges. Yet, as the night wore on, curiosity crept upon me like the chill that sometimes swept through the halls when the air conditioning kicked in too strongly. I decided that before the night ended, I would at least glance through the window of room 19. As dawn approached, painting the sky with strokes of orange and pink, I felt the weight of another night shift lifting. I prepared to hand over to the day staff, my report a monotonous drone of stable conditions and administered medications. The sameness of it all was both a comfort and a curse. It allowed for few surprises, but also few opportunities for anything remarkable. Exiting the ICU, I cast one last glance over my shoulder. The mystery of room 19 lingering in my mind, its door now closed, a silent sentinel against the coming day. The normalcy of my routine seemed to warp slightly around that room, as if its mere presence suggested a story yet untold, a deviation from my well-trodden path that awaited me when night fell again. The next night, as I crossed the threshold of St. John's ICU, a sense of anticipation stirred within me. My footsteps echoed slightly louder, my senses tinged with a readiness that was unusual for the beginning of my shift. The enigma of room 19 beckoned, and I knew tonight would not pass without confronting whatever, or whoever, lay beyond its door. As per routine, I began my rounds, each patient's room a familiar haven of whispered breaths and steady beeping. However, my thoughts repeatedly strayed to the new patient. By the time I reached room 19, my curiosity had morphed into a quiet resolve. Peering through the glass pane on the door, I saw him for the first time. The man appeared remarkably ordinary, his features calm, almost serene under the pale lighting. His eyes were closed, and his chest rose and fell with the rhythm of the ventilator. Nothing about him suggested the unsettling whispers that circulated among the staff. Summoning my professionalism, I pushed the door open. The room felt cooler than the others, the air tinged with a sterile sharpness. He stirred as I approached, his eyes fluttering open to fix on me with a clarity that seemed out of place in the dimly lit room. "Good evening," I started, keeping my tone light, yet professional. "I'm Nurse Hawthorne. I'll be looking after you tonight." He nodded slightly, his throat working as if he struggled to speak. When he finally did, his voice was a rasping whisper. "You look like someone who listens." I paused, a shiver tracing my spine, despite the warmth of my uniform. "I try to," I replied, maintaining eye contact, though part of me wanted to look away. His gaze held a depth that felt almost invasive. They will start soon, he murmured, turning his gaze towards the window where the night sky was visible, its darkness seeming to seep through the glass. The deaths! Listen to them and you might save them. The words hung between us, cryptic and heavy with an ominous weight. I tried to brush it off with a professional smile, attributing his words to delirium, often caused by medication or the disorientation of waking in ICU. Rest now. You need your strength, I reassured him, checking his IV lines and making notes in his chart to discuss his condition with the doctor. As the night progressed, his prediction gnawed at me. The ICU, usually a place where I felt in control, began to feel claustrophobic, each monitor's beep a reminder of the fragility of life. When the code blue alarm sounded later, a jolt of fear shot through me. It was Mr. Daniels in room 24, a patient who had been stable throughout my previous shifts. Despite the team's efforts, we lost him, an event that was, by itself, not unusual in the ICU, but in light of the new patient's warning, it felt sinister. Returning to room 19, I found the new patient asleep, or perhaps pretending to be. The rest of the night, I wrestled with rational explanations for what he had said. But as dawn crept up and I prepared to leave, the unease settled deeper into my bones. It was only the first death, and if there was any truth to his words, it wouldn't be the last. His prediction had been accurate this time, and the coincidence was too stark to ignore. With a growing sense of dread, I realized that tonight was just the beginning. As I left the hospital, the morning light did little to lift the darkness that had settled inside me. The next few nights drew a heavy veil of dread over me as I walked the now hauntingly familiar corridors of the ICU. The new patient, Mr. Neville, became the center of whispered speculations among the staff, though to most he was just another face in a bed, his ominous presence unnoticed. But for me, each shift began with a tightening in my chest, an apprehension I couldn't shake. I approached Mr. Neville's room with a mix of reluctance and a compulsion to understand more about his unsettling ability. As I entered, his eyes met mine with that same penetrating gaze, a look that seemed to see right through the facade of normalcy. "You heard it, didn't you?" he asked quietly, his voice raspy but intense. "Yes," I admitted, the memory of the previous night's code still fresh, the desperation as we tried to revive Mr. Daniels replaying in my mind. "How do you know these things?" Mr. Neville shifted slightly in his bed, his face contorted momentarily as if in pain, or perhaps it was remorse. "It's a curse," he murmured, looking away toward the window where the darkness of night pressed against the glass like a solid entity. "I hear their last thoughts, their regrets. It comes in whispers, just before they pass." His confession unsettled me further, yet it compelled me to learn more, to perhaps prevent another unexpected death. "Can we stop it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, fear mingling with a flicker of hope. He shook his head slowly, his eyes somber. "I don't control it, I only hear it. But maybe if you listen, you might find a way." Determined, I tightened my grasp on my duties. My senses heightened to every sound, every sigh that drifted through the ICU. That night, another whisper of impending doom circled around a patient in room 27, Miss Harper. This time I was ready. I hovered near, watching her vitals, adjusting her medication in anticipation of the worst. Yet despite my efforts, the night ended with Miss Harper's steady decline, and by dawn we had lost her too. The pattern repeated, each prediction a burden that grew heavier with each passing night. I documented everything. Mr. Neville's predictions, the patient's conditions, what worked, and what didn't. None of the other staff believed me, their skepticism rooted in medical science and rationality, things I too had once held dear. My conversations with Mr. Neville deepened, each night a foray into the unknown depths of his cursed gift. He spoke of voices that filled his head, of the loneliness that came with such knowledge. "It's like being in a room full of voices, all talking at once, but only I can hear them," he explained one night, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The atmosphere in the ICU grew tense, my colleagues watching with wary eyes as I spent more time with Mr. Neville, my notes filling up with observations that none could rationalize. The hospital became a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, each turn a reminder of the unseen forces at play. each decision tinged with the fear of what might come to pass. As the week drew to a close, a storm gathered outside, the wind howling like the voices Mr. Neville described. The night was particularly dark, the power flickered, casting us into shadows intermittently. It was then that Mr. Neville gave his most chilling prediction yet. "Tonight," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "the storm won't be the only thing that claims lives." The weight of his words settled over me like a shroud. Armed with a desperate need to alter whatever fate awaited us, I steeled myself for a night that promised revelations or a reckoning. Either way, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The storm raged outside, its fury echoing the chaos brewing within the walls of St. John's ICU. Rain battered against the windows, and thunder rolled overhead, mirroring the turmoil in my heart as I prepared for what Mr. Neville had forewarned. His last prediction loomed over me, a spectral shadow that darkened every thought. Armed with a sense of grim determination, I moved through the ICU with a vigilance born of the past night's tragedies. I checked every monitor, adjusted every IV, and reassured every patient with a touch or a word, though my own fears gnawed at me relentlessly. As I entered Mr. Neville's room, the dim emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across his face. He looked up, his expression grave. "It's close," he whispered, an edge of urgency in his voice. "The voices are loud, chaotic. They're scared." "What can I do?" I asked, feeling helpless against the unseen forces he described. The feeling of being merely a spectator in my own profession was suffocating. "Listen," he urged, his eyes intense. "You might not stop it, but you can ease their passing. Be with them." Taking his words to heart, I returned to my rounds, each step heavy with the weight of impending loss. The ICU felt different that night, as if it breathed in sync with the storm, each gust of wind a collective sigh of the dying. Then amidst the cacophony of the storm, the code alarm sounded. It was a sound I had come to dread, yet expected. I rushed to the indicated room, Ms. Lowell in room 22, her heart monitor screaming its high-pitched warning. The team assembled quickly, a practiced dance of life-saving measures unfolding, each of us playing our role with desperate urgency. Despite our efforts, the storm outside seemed to seep into our bones, chilling us with its might, as if claiming Miss Lowell was its due. As the night progressed, another alarm, another rush. The pattern was relentless. With each code, I felt a part of me wither, the hope of changing fate dwindling into resignation. Mr. Neville's room became a sanctuary between the battles, his presence a constant reminder of the role I had chosen, to be a listener, a keeper of last moments. The final hours of my shift approached with the slow light of dawn, the storm subsiding, as if its thirst had been quenched by the souls it had claimed. Returning to Mr. Neville, I found him quieter, his usual readiness to speak replaced by a somber stillness. "It's over," he said simply, his voice a mere whisper. "For tonight, at least." Exhausted, I sank into a chair beside his bed. "Why? Why tell me all this if we can't stop it?" He turned to look at me, his eyes weary but clear. "Because knowledge is a burden, but also a gift. You listened when no one else would. You cared. That's all we can do in the end. Bear witness, ease the passing, and remember." The sun's rays began to break over the horizon, casting light on the remnants of the night's tempest. As I left the hospital that morning, the weight of Mr. Neville's words settled in my heart. The world seemed quieter, the hospital's corridors less daunting. I had faced the darkest hours a nurse could know, not with the power to save, but with the resolve to be present, to listen, to comfort, and ultimately to accept the whispered truths of life and death.